So we're going to talk about two exhibitions that we've been to see for the Sculpture Forum. We're gathered in Maud Britt's apartment. Thank you, Maud. Two exhibitions that we went to see, and now seen them twice. Juan Munoz at David Zwirner Gallery, and an exhibition of Michael Heiser's work at Gagosian Gallery. Both exhibitions are still up for some time, so they can be seen. The two galleries are just one block apart. It's very easy to walk from one to the other, which we did. And I don't know why I thought there was some kind of way in which these two shows had a connection, which was to do with theatricality. And that's what made me think we might talk about them together. Juan Munoz was born in 1953, and he died very young, at the age of 48. Michael Heiser was born in 1944 and is still at it. And Michael Heiser is much better known, I think, for major kind of earthworks out in the landscape, and not particularly well known for gallery works. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there and get my colleagues Brant Junsu, who's here, and Jock Ireland, who is here, to say a few words before I go further.
Yeah, and Brant, you like that connection there?
Yeah, it's certainly there. I think there's a pretense in Heitzer's work, a long-standing pretense that there is no theatricality. You know, that somehow his work is what it is, it stands for itself. And I think, in fact, it's enormously effect-driven. And in the case of this gallery show, it's depictive. I mean, those Corten slabs, they're not slabs. They're hollow. They're fabricated. And, the whole show, although it sort of has this, heavy echoes of earthwork and things in situ and things modulated since they were created by, geologic forces, it's fabricated, and it was fabricated for travel. And the gallery, opened up the airlock to the street to bring those things in, and they were assembled. And the stones do not rest on those slabs; they're fastened.
Yes.
It's a show. It's an exhibition.
Yeah, I understand, and in that sense, there's an element of pretense in those Heiser pieces, and there's an element of pretense in this Munoz work. I think there's another word that might be, relevant, and that's drama. And I think while Michael Heiser's work may not want to be thought of as theatrical, it is certainly intended, I think, to be dramatic. There's no question that when you walk into Gagosian space, those things are out of place in a way that is quite dramatic. I mean, they are just so huge and imposing. That one can't help but feel a kind of impact, a kind of, oh wow, whatever you think of them as sculptures, that there's no question that entering that space is, there's a moment of real sense that something is unexpected and quite extraordinary.
Not extraordinary for the art world, where there's enormous budgets for enormous gestures. And the crazy thing about that stuff is it's so pristine. It's antiseptically clean. The stones are washed. They're immaculate. And the corten is weathered just so. I mean, it's, it's really groomed. It's not geologic, and it's not. It's got no aroma of the steel mill either.
Yeah, I do think that drama is a better, or I'm more comfortable with that word, drama. The theatricality brings in Michael Fried and complexities that are, I don't think we have time to deal with. The thing, though, is that even though it wants to be dramatic, it's disappointing to me. And for just the reasons, Brent, this antiseptic business, this Michael Heiser, I was introduced to Michael Heiser sort of 50 years ago, not personally, but just, and I came in contact with this, the earthworks, or and that contact was not direct. I'd never been to Nevada, but it was a big sort of idea for me. I can, to simplify it, the idea that America was bigger than New York City, the idea that America was not Europe. Mm-hmm. All of those things were, at least in part, delivered by Michael Heiser and, Smiths and DeMary and a bunch of other people. But that was an exciting moment. And it's sort of very disappointing to see that this is what's happening now, 50 years later. And I'm thinking or trying to think about that. I remember being introduced to poets like Charles Olson and Charles Olson is maybe a good example, but just a whole bunch of poets who kind of came out of Ezra Pound and just brought in all kinds of non-European things into their poetry, and that was exciting. And the thing is, there was Pound, then there's Olson and Creeley, and even now my favorite poet is a guy who studied at Stanford and with Ivor Winters, and still connected to that I don't know, Wild West in quotes tradition, a sort of non-tradition tradition. And the thing is that in poetry, it's exciting. I'm still excited by Ezra Pound, and other poets are feeding off of that in a way that the art world stuff seems to me to have died. I mean, it's a big show at Gagosian and enormous expense and all that, but it's not. It doesn't feed me.
Well, I mean, Michael Heiser's, I guess, his major double negative, that enormous kind of excavation, was 1969, and Heiser would still be quite a young man at that time.
Yeah.
And most of that important kind of, I think, whatever you want to call it, land art that you referenced, was going on then, wasn't it, in the late 60s, early 70s. And it does seem to me to be, quite distinctly American in a way. I mean, it has always seemed to me that American sculpture has differentiated itself in some way from European sculpture in releasing itself from or losing its connection to architecture, and seeking in a way to become a kind of a marker in the landscape, rather than something integrated into an urban situation. And so, I mean, Heiser's a pioneer in that work. And I can share your sense of disappointment in this gallery show. And I mean, in the sense, as I noted to begin with, I don't think Heiser is known for gallery, sculpture. If it's called upon to do this, or somehow or other there's commercial interests involved. And I mean, I agree. I mean, for the initial impact of walking into Gagosian's gallery, it didn't hold up. I mean, I did not find myself wanting to spend much more time there. I had the strangest idea that these things might make nice earrings if they were shrunk, and the Corten steel became precious metal, and the rocks became, precious stones, precious gems of some kind, that they could actually make, really kind of lovely, unusual, and distinctive kind of earrings. That is not a kind thing to say, I don't know, but I mean, I found myself having that thought, which I guess is to say that I didn't feel in the end that the physical size of the things was justified. And I wondered how they came about. I mean, there must have been some making of models, on a much smaller scale, in order to prepare for the presumably they were put together in some kind of facility where they can handle such massive steel plates and great rocks. Anyway, you were also disappointed with the Munoz show, John?
Yeah. For different reasons. I lost track of it as sculpture, or I found myself going up to the figures in the piece, and then looking at the figure and then saying, okay, the figure itself is disappointing as sculpture, but then I sort of recognized that the figure is not the point, and it's the whole room that I'm supposed to engage with, and then I just had trouble engaging with the whole room, I'd come from seeing Mark Morris dance a week or two before the show, and I kept thinking about the dancers on the stage and how exciting that was, and how coherent as an artwork, and the multiple figures in the Munoz pieces sort of made me think of that. But they just, the stage, the space, left me disappointed, and left me disappointed as the Heiser work wasn't exciting as sculpture for me, and the Munoz wasn't exciting as sculpture. Mark Morris was exciting as dance, and the poets that I talk about, they kept making poetry, and they made sort of better and better poetry, or it was always poetry. With these two shows, there's part of my disappointment, at least, comes from their trying to be something more than just sculpture, losing kind of contact with the discipline, tradition. And I was sort of worried that am I expecting all sculpture shows to be full of Donatello-like figures.
You'd be disappointed.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, in the sense that I think both shows are to be, you know, the ambition is to make an installation, is to make you know, to take over the space in a way that creates, you know, in the case of Munoz in particular, a sensation that you might have walked onto a stage where everything has suddenly become frozen, you know, or you might have walked into a film set where everything, the director just said, stop, and everything froze and became bronze, you know.
Yeah.
I didn't find, I mean, I did find the space in the Gagosian gallery, you know, kind of in some way, kind of like, you know, energized just by the massiveness of these things that were occupying it. I did not find the spaces in the Munoz show as energized as I would think they. I mean, according to Munoz himself, he speaks about that. You know, I mean, I found, I agree with you. I mean, I found the figures, you know, they seemed in some ways, I mean, I found myself thinking, and this is again not a terribly kind thing to say, well-intentioned. The whole thing was well-intentioned. You know, which I think kind of, when I heard myself say that to myself, this is well-intentioned. It's as if somehow the intention and the work are not integrated. The intentions exist somehow or other, but they didn't arise from the work, but arose separately and exist separately. Yeah. You can't say that the Heiser's work is well-intentioned. I mean, that's in a way a plus.
That's a hell of a comment. It's really pithy. I think it's really true. They're self-regardful.
Yeah.
They're statements of self that really don't need anyone or anything.
Yeah.
And the works don't relate to each other whatsoever, or to the room. And the stone doesn't relate to the steel. It's like purest, and for me, kind of emptiest gesture. But the Munoz show, you know, it's interesting for me hearing some of the points that you make. I would advocate for the show, but I think that you are onto things that I see as well. He was, you know, for me, he was kind of like a breaking out important young artist when I was a kid, and since then he's acquired an almost saintly reputation, based in part on his personal relationship to people who've written about him, you know, who greatly admire him. And I remember at that time that it was a fresh breeze. It was kind of like looking back, a kind of hyper-rational, in many ways, art world. And he was one of the few artists who were introducing something that wasn't strictly rational, that was idiosyncratic and you know, personal in a different way.
He left Spain. I went to London, I think around 1970, where he studied for a period of time at various schools, including the Central School, and met and got to know people there who I know. I never met him, but I wonder if he encountered the work of a British sculptor perhaps not well known here, called John Davis, who at that time was making figurative tableau of a number of figures doing very strange things, odd, quirky, dark, really enigmatic kind of groups of figures dressed in real clothing, and not cast in bronze. They had a presence that was very different from the Munoz figures in this show. But I wonder if he'd come across John Davis's work at that time.
Yeah, it would be remarkably similar schemes.
Yes. And at that time, John's work was very much, out of left field in terms of what was going on in London, what was being given, the general kind of sense of what was interesting and appropriate as sculpture.
To Jock's point, it impressed me. It's been a while since I've seen these things, and it impressed me this time around that they're not wonderfully produced in the sense of a sculptor, working at length in one place with things he's familiar with and continues to reshape. They're kind of episodic, and there's almost a kind of like what I gather, kind of amateur way of going about his work in the best sense, in the sense of like the great 18th century amateur architects were really terrific architects, but were often backed up by someone more professional. And these things, I could wish that they were, kind of handled differently. But it struck me that the handling is appropriate to the kind of situational aspect of the work, which is really where it's at. He considered himself or called himself a storyteller, but I don't see it being narrative. It's really situational. There's not a beginning, middle, end. There's not a development in time.
Well, I don't want to contradict you, but encountering these things, one would think there's a story here. There has to be a story here. What is, there needs to be a narrative, as it were, in order to bring these things to life.
Yeah, but the story remains pretty elusive.
Yeah, but nevertheless, maybe one is invited to make up one's own story. I don't know, but
well, yeah, and a lot of his following is among literary people who do go ahead and sort of make I'm not that familiar with the writing about it, but the bits and pieces I've read are pretty sophisticated, and sort of more sophisticated than the work.
Well, that would suggest that one of the things that I found myself again thinking about the work was, and again, it's not a nice thing to say, but it has a kind of illustrative element.
Right.
And I'm interested, Brant, that you say he has a saintly reputation. Which I was not aware of. Aware that he has a reputation, but it characterized as somebody who is. Has that got anything to do with having died so young? Died at the age of 48.
It has something to do with that. A sort of a secular saint. Not a holier than thou person at all, but someone called to a vision, something more like that. It strikes me that although he was working up until he was 48, it felt like a young person's work, like something that was put together relatively hastily and could be, developed over time. I have no sense that was his interest, that he would ever remake anything or revisit anything. But I could wish that he did or would.
Yeah, just a whole lot of bright ideas sort of fell out of his head, but things weren't refined. Though what fell out of his head was attractive to literary people, or he has a kind of appeal. Maybe the literary people were all older than he. But that sense of somebody adopting him and sort of helping him by filling in the blanks. These 18th century architects that you were talking about, I don't know any of them, but I have the sense that when he turned whatever he turned over to the foundry, by casting them in bronze, sort of functioned in the way a sort of professional architect might have.
There's something about the fact that they were cast in bronze I did not care for. I would much rather have seen what was it that was cast. In bronze, they seemed to be deadened in a way.
Exactly.
And I ended up feeling, because of all of this bronze, that the whole thing began to feel somewhat tedious, and I would really have loved to see what it was he actually made and handed over to the foundry, which I think could have been a lot more interesting and alive. Good.